Welcome everyone to our What Matters to Me and Why talk. I'm Stacy Kopp. I'm from the Department of Material Science and Engineering. And on behalf of the entire organizing committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to another What Matters to Me and Why talk here at UC Irvine. First, some housekeeping announcements. The talk is being filmed, so by entering the room, you've consented to being filmed. If you don't want to appear on the video, just move to the back of the room. But please, you're welcome at the front of the room. I don't want to be alone up here. Also, please wait for the microphone during the Q&A session following the talk so that people on Zoom can hear you. And then you can pick up a box lunch and sign in the room over there if you haven't already. Because of the rain, it's not right outside. As staff, faculty, and students, we spend a lot of our time dealing with exams, homework, lectures, budgets, personnel, and other topics. Doing the things that are required to keep UCI and our careers running. What matters to me and why is a chance to take a few minutes each month to stop and take a break from that. Every month we have the opportunity to hear from someone who shapes UC Irvine through their daily activities. They give a short, informal talk, followed by ample time for questions and discussion. There's no prescribed topic. Speakers are simply asked to answer the question, what matters to you and why? And authentically answer this, and then take the talk wherever it goes. The series provides a forum for speakers to talk about values, beliefs, and motivations, and perhaps to share how some of these have been shaped by their personal experiences, including both the highs and the lows encountered along the way. The hope is to strengthen the bonds between faculty, students, and staff who teach, learn, and work here, and to celebrate both the diversity of our community and the commonalities that bind us together. One thing that's really nice about What Matters to Me and Why is that it brings people from all across campus, undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, staff, faculty. So it's one of our traditions to give all of you a chance to introduce yourselves to one another. If you're on the Zoom, you'll all be sent to breakout rooms of about 4 people. And then here in the room, please also make little groups. And then we hope that you'll introduce yourselves, tell others your name, department, a little bit about who you are, faculty, student, staff, and how you heard about this talk. This will be a few minutes, and then we'll bring you back and introduce our speaker. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to bring it back, and let me introduce our speaker. David Kaye is a clinical professor of law in our School of Law and the former United Nations Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right of freedom of opinion and expression. He is the 2023-2024 Fulbright Distinguished Scholar in Public International Law at Lund University in Sweden and the U.S. Independent Expert to the European Commission for Democracy Through Law. His 2019 book, Speech Police, The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, explores the ways in which companies, governments, and activities struggle to define the rules for online expression. Appointed by the UN Human Rights Council in June 2024, David served through July 2020. He was appointed in June of 2014, David served through July 2020 as the global body's principal monitor for freedom of expression issues worldwide. His earlier reporting addressed, among other topics, the ways in which artificial intelligence technologies implicate human rights issues, the global private surveillance industry, its impact on freedom of expression, growing repression of freedom of expression globally, encryption and anonymity as promoters of freedom of expression, the protection of whistleblowers and journalistic sources, the roles and responsibilities of private internet companies, and the regulation of online content by social media and search companies. After doing his undergraduate and graduate work at UC Berkeley, he stayed with UC now. After that, he joined the U.S. State Department as a lawyer in 1995, serving in Washington, D.C., The Hague in the Netherlands. In addition to his academic work, he is the independent board chair of the Global Network Initiative and a trustee of the Global Freedom of Expression Organization, Article 19. Please help me welcome Professor David Kaye.
Thank you. Let me just go back here. You don't need a picture of me from my childhood. Thank you for that kind introduction. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today. This is supposed to be what matters to me. I'm not used to sort of bearing my soul, to any audience, really, to anyone. But I hope today to do a few different things. I'll very quickly just give you a little sketch of where I come from and why I'm a California snob, basically. But then I want to, in a way, talk a little bit about law, how at least my own experience of, let's say, public protest and public life shaped where I am today and what I do today, really. I'll talk a little bit about some takeaways that at least I would take from what I'll talk about. I'll close with a poem by Czesław Miłosz, but I'm not going to read the poem fully. And then just open it up to questions. So, So very quickly, let me just tell you, I grew up in Ventura County. That's me wearing, I don't know if anybody remembers Senor Lopez. That's what this, anyway. So I grew up in Ventura County. My favorite athlete was Tony Dorsett. Why Tony Dorsett? He was a Dallas Cowboy. The Dallas Cowboys had their summer training. I know they were America's team. I thought you had to like them. This is the 70s, okay? They did their summer training in Thousand Oaks, where I grew up. My favorite artist growing up was Elvis Costello. My favorite movie is Wings of Desire, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. It's one of the great movies of all time. Okay, that's me. That's like all I'm gonna say that's really personal. Okay, so what I wanna do is start with the 1970s, basically, just to give you a little bit of a sense of why I do what I do today. So, I mean, what I do is I teach law here at UCI. I teach public international law. I teach freedom of expression. I teach human rights law. I teach humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, the law of war. But I sort of came to that through my own experiences growing up. So I grew up in the suburbs of LA, basically. I came from a family that, like, my grandparents came between the First and Second World War from Eastern Central Europe. My parents grew up in the Midwest. They moved to Thousand Oaks. They were very involved in the Jewish community. And back then, in the 70s, like, the heart of activism in the Jewish community, for those who might remember it or you've read about it, was not what it is today, mainly because the focus was on the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. And it was really a focus on the Jews of the Soviet Union. So there were millions of Jews who lived in the Soviet Union, hundreds of thousands of whom tried to leave, and they were denied the ability to leave the country. They were denied the ability to practice their religion. Actually, a pretty common, common form of repression around the world. If you think of Baha'i in Iran, or Shia in Saudi Arabia, or we could go down a very long list, that kind of repression is pretty common. But the inability to leave was a fundamental violation of the right to freedom of movement, a right that is, guaranteed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So in the 70s, when I was a kid, basically all of our activism was focused, to the extent there was activism, was focused on freedom of movement for Jews in the Soviet Union. At least that was my own community's sort of focus, and that's what my parents kind of gave to me in a way. This is actually from a march in the 70s. There were about 250,000 people gathered in Washington, as you could see on the Mall, for a major rally in support of Soviet Jewry and the right of Jews to leave the Soviet Union. So that sort of was my first brush with human rights. This is a really unfortunate headline. And it's a weird headline, to be honest, but I think it's kind of weirdly, it's peculiar, right? But from that, I became very involved in basically Holocaust era education. When I was 16, I was part of a kind of an international youth movement, and this is before sort of the current, I would call it kind of concentration camp tourism, which that sounds really derogatory, but there is a kind of tourism, like a lot of people go to Auschwitz, to other camps, particularly in Poland. In 1985, that was pretty unusual because Poland was still sort of behind the Iron Curtain, as you might say. It was a very poor country, but about 50 of us were brought together to do a tour of the concentration camps in Poland. These are obviously places that were basically killing factories. Millions of Jews, Roma, others were murdered in these camps. And it was sort of my first kind of coming in, when I was doing Soviet Jewry-oriented activism as a kid, it was so distant. And this brought something else like very close to me. And it brought both the idea that people can do really evil things, that there's evil in the world, and also that educating ourselves about that past is really crucial to deciding how we build a better world. So those are basically, that's early me and what matters to me. This is Mario Savio. Mario Savio was the leader of the free speech movement in Berkeley, and he's basically the reason why I went to Cal. So if you could imagine, I was, obviously pretty focused on world affairs as a teenager and before. And, I wanted to go to a school that at least I thought, this is the 80s, I thought it would be kind of politically active. It wasn't the 60s. Berkeley in the 80s was great, but it wasn't quite this. But this is what brought me to Berkeley. And the thing I want to highlight is just this language. So some of you might be familiar with the fact that the free speech movement in the United States started at Berkeley in 1964. And it was, in a way, like it wasn't about the Vietnam War, which is what I think many people's image of campus life in the 60s and early 70s might have been. It was really about a conflict between students who wanted more control over their own academic destiny and university leadership, right? And so when Mario Savio says this, when he says that you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make this machine stop, he's not just talking about government. He's actually talking about the president of the University of California, Clark Kerr, which, maybe don't tell the chancellor about this part of my talk, but this was this effort at Berkeley to, basically take your activism, take your pamphleting on campus, to allow that all to happen and to kind of take control of your education. And to me, going into, to my college years, that was really meaningful to me. I didn't know if that actually existed anymore in Berkeley, but this was essentially why I went to Cal. Okay. So I'm getting into more like what I actually do today. And the segue is this. This is Dushanbe, Tajikistan. After college, I worked in Washington for a little bit. The Soviet Union collapsed on Christmas Day, 1991. I had been thinking that I would go trekking in Nepal or something before law school, but this seemed more interesting. So I went to the former Soviet Union then, and specifically to Central Asia. And in part, this was my connection to Soviet Jewry. So a Soviet Jewry organization that I had been connected with had no idea what was happening in Central Asia. And by Central Asia, I mean the states of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. Those were the four that I visited. And in Tajikistan, in Dushanbe, the capital, in 1992, there was massive unrest against basically a continuing cadre of Soviet officials who still ran the country. And I was fascinated by the fact that so soon after, these decades of repression, people actually went out into the street, which you can see here, in order to protest the government and to basically call for democracy, to call for open, free elections. They were met by basically Soviet-era police on the streets. I left about a week before civil war broke out in Tajikistan. But this moment, and I was doing reporting for this Soviet Jewry organization and for a magazine, for me, it just brought out how much desire, or at least it gave me an indication, how much a desire there was for democracy, for basically controlling your destiny in these newly independent republics. So I went to law school after that, and and this is my shortwave radio, which is very important to me. I don't know why I put that in there. Anyway, okay, so fast forward, I went to law school, and here's where I want to just talk about basically two different things that, at least from a matter of law, and these will be short stories, really shaped what I do today. Okay, so everybody knows probably the story or the history of September 11th, 2001. At the time, I was a lawyer at the State Department. It happened to be my daughter's first day of nursery school. It was also a day I was in the office. We were all evacuated. It so happened that my portfolio as a lawyer at the State Department was responsibility for the Geneva Conventions. Okay, so the Geneva Conventions are the international treaties that essentially establish the fundamental rules of behavior for militaries, both in times of peace and in times of conflict. And one of the areas of the Geneva Conventions, the third Geneva Convention, basically says that you need to treat all prisoners humanely, prisoners of war in particular, that is the opposing army essentially, have particular rights. And in order to avoid providing those rights, you better have a very good reason for it, right? There's a lot of history behind that. But basically, in 2001, going into early 2002, there started to be a big debate within the Bush administration. And I was a lawyer hired through a civil service process, so I was not a political appointee. Right? I joined the State Department under the Clinton administration, even though I wasn't sort of hired by the Clinton team. And so I wasn't a political person. I was just a lawyer at the State Department. And our belief, at least among the lawyers and the military folks at the Pentagon, was that, look, we don't want to get into, backing up slightly, as we find in our custody individuals who were either responsible for or alleged to be responsible for 9/11, or were members of Al-Qaeda, which was responsible for 9/11, or members of the Taliban, the governing authority in Afghanistan at the time, who are now governing again, then no matter what, they should be treated as if they were prisoners of war. Not because we believe they deserve that necessarily, like if you went through all of the legal issues, that all of them deserve that kind of status, but because any other decision would strip them of basic rights. And we were very concerned, certainly at the State Department, that if you didn't provide those basic rights to individuals who were in your custody, you kind of opened the door to inhumane treatment. And if you fast forward a couple of years, the world came to know that actually many of the people who were held at Guantanamo and elsewhere were subjected to torture, to waterboarding, to all sorts of inhumane treatment. So we had this massive debate basically in January of 2002 about whether the Geneva Conventions even applied in the context of the early war in Afghanistan. Many from the Bush administration, I would say the political lawyers, said, no, it doesn't apply. It can't apply because Afghanistan is a failed state. The Taliban are not. They don't wear the appropriate uniform to be representatives of an armed force. All of this that actually had no basis in the Geneva Conventions itself. And so we argued, again at State, that actually, if you look at the Geneva Conventions, Members of the Taliban should be treated as prisoners of war. Members of Al-Qaeda, probably not, but it shouldn't matter. They should still be treated humanely in accordance with both humanitarian and human rights law. All right, so it might be kind of a, well, we had very strong support. We were lucky in the State Department that the legal advisor at the time was William H. Taft IV, great-grandson of President Taft, and Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State at the time. Both they agreed with us. So we were lucky in that. I actually worry about present lawyers at the State Department because they don't have that same kind of support. But they agreed with us and kind of led this fight. And maybe it's a suggestion that I'm not a very good lawyer. We lost the battle. But the point that I took away from this was, one, that just because the law says something, or the law means something, or the law requires the government to act in a certain way, even in our democracy, and I was a government lawyer. I had this belief that the United States government would act in accordance with both domestic and international law. This whole episode suggested to me that wasn't actually true, that international law, at least to some in the government, didn't matter as much as it should, and that rule of law is important because if you avoid the rule of law, you go down this path towards what ultimately in this situation was a situation of torture and of illegal conduct. So this was a very important kind of turning point for me in my career. And, there was no guarantee for me that I wasn't sort of destined to go into academics. But I was definitely, after this episode, destined to leave government service because it was just a very punishing kind of episode for me. So this is not a very good-looking slide. But I want to sort of fast forward a little bit to. So I worked at the State Department. I ended up leaving after serving in The Hague. So The Hague is the capital of the Netherlands. It's actually, there's two capitals in the Netherlands. Anyway, not super important. It's where the state is. And so I was at the U.S. Embassy in The Hague for 3 years, did a lot of work with the International Criminal Tribunal on the former Yugoslavia, so the War Crimes Court for Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Court, which the United States has long kind of kept an arm's length distance at best from, but we were in touch with them pretty regularly. And then my wife and I decided it was time to go home, time to go back to California. It's like I said at the beginning, I'm a California snob. So we were ready to come back home. And I ended up at UCLA. Erwin Chemerinsky became the founding dean of this law school at UCI. Erwin is an amazing human and a really terrific, like one of the leading constitutional scholars in the United States. And so when a call came from a former classmate of mine from law school, Mario Barnes, who's a professor at UCI, asking if I was interested in coming here, it was like not even a question. Although I still live in LA, so I have this commute, and I grew up, anyway, you grew up in Ventura County or LA County, you went like, really, I'm gonna go to Orange County? Anyway, it's turned out, it's fantastic. And so I've been teaching, as I said at the beginning, international law in a clinic and so forth. And as you could see at the beginning of my presentation, I've been committed to things like public protest, freedom of expression, the ideals of public debate. I mean, that came from both the world of the Soviet Jewry movement, but also education around Holocaust and genocide era kinds of claims and the importance of that education. So I was teaching freedom of expression in the context of human rights when the United Nations appointed me as the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression. And I wanted to sort of do a little diversion for a moment to talk a little bit about freedom of expression as a matter of human rights law. So here's the more like pedantic, international lawyer talk. So if you think about free speech, which sort of in the news every day in the United States right now, when you think about it from the perspective of the First Amendment, right? The First Amendment of the Constitution says what? Does anybody remember, like, just offhand what the First Amendment says? Like, yeah? So speech and protest are in there. The way it's actually framed is that Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. And then there's some more on religion, but I'm going to sort of put that over here for a second. So it's directed towards Congress, right? Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. It's something that we as Americans, I think, embrace, and it's in some respects at the heart of our identity, at least our political identity. And it's great. And a lot of jurisprudence has developed around the First Amendment, particularly over the last 50, 60 years. But look at how Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights frames it. So the ICCPR, this treaty, is the main treaty in international human rights law. It's also one of the few treaties that the United States has actually ratified. So we are a party to it. The United States is bound to this. So what do you recognize that's different here? What's different about this language? This language doesn't direct itself toward the state making a law. It's flipped around, right? It's flipped around in the way it says everyone, and I'll just skip to the second paragraph, everyone shall have a right. So again, First Amendment, Congress shall make no law. Human rights law, Article 19, everyone shall have this right. I think that's an important kind of switch. It's important for a couple of reasons. It's certainly important in the context of thinking about non-state actors who might interfere with freedom of expression and the role of the state in protecting that right, protecting you against third parties, which could be massive companies, could be others. We could talk a little bit about who those might be in Q&A. But this language is really important, and I just want to highlight it for highlight a couple of the elements of it. So it defines freedom of expression, right? Again, in a way that the First Amendment does not. It defines it as the right or the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media of one's choice. All right, I love this language. I mean, so if what matters to me is like, if there's a particular takeaway, this is what matters to me as much as anything in international law. And it matters to me for several reasons. One, because I think freedom of expression is indeed a cornerstone of democratic societies. But also think about this language and think about how current it is as well. So it's not just, we think of First Amendment often as freedom of the speaker. I think that's how Elon Musk thinks about it, right? Whatever the speaker wants to say, they shouldn't be disabled from saying it, right? But here, it's not only imparting information, right? It's also seeking and receiving information. So individuals have the right of access to information. I have the right to access information that you might have or ideas that you might have. That means that if there's an interference with that, this speaks to that. It speaks to that right? It's also information and ideas of all kinds. So it's categorical in that sense. It's regardless of frontiers, which means if somebody has something to say or post in China, this is my 24 minutes mark. So I'm gonna wrap this up pretty soon. If someone has something to say anywhere in the world, I have a right to access that as well. It's regardless of frontiers. Now, there are restrictions on it, and the restrictions are where like most of the action is in law school. That's where we spend most of our time. But this idea that freedom of expression is so important to democracy, and that we should have not only the right to speak, but the right to access information and to seek out information. It's also kind of perfect for the digital age, right? Seek, receive, and impart is like browse, download, and post. Right? This is language that should speak to all of us, and I think it does in a way more than the First Amendment. Okay, this was more of a flex than anything else. This was like a high point of my life, which was getting Jimmy Carter to listen to me say something. This is the International Court of Justice. Again, as you saw from my commitment to international law, my commitment to international law means I'm also committed to it when, the cases are complex. So last year, you might remember that South Africa brought a claim against Israel, arguing that Israel was in violation of the Genocide Convention in the context of its war in Gaza. The arrow is only just to me because I was lucky enough to get in there for the hearing. But I believe in these kinds of processes, even if they make us uncomfortable about what they're trying to achieve, or maybe excite you about what they're trying to achieve. There are rules of law that apply in these contexts. Okay, so I just have a few takeaways that I'll mention very briefly, and then I'll stop and we can definitely go into Q&A. Okay, one is there's forces in our world opposed to public value. I mean, there's no question about that, right? I mean, if those forces didn't exist, we wouldn't need to be activists. We wouldn't need to, go out into campus or go out into the street. And I'm not going to make this a political talk, but you can imagine from your own experiences why this might matter to say at the outset. I also think the world is changeable. So my sort of formative experience in the world in a lot of respects was going to the former Soviet Union and seeing how actually there was massive change taking place, right? So the things that we see today in the world don't mean that they're static. There's always room for some kind of change around the world. Individuals matter, right? So for all of those different areas that I mentioned, whether it was Soviet Jewry or kind of Holocaust remembrance, or the activity of Mario Savio leading people in Berkeley, it was individuals who actually took certain risks and made something happen. Like, things don't just happen. They require us to act on them. Another is that there's no just like single path to doing whatever it is. I mean, I say doing good in the world, whatever good is for you, there's no single path. So in my own experience, I was sort of a, independent activist as a kid. I worked for the government for 10 years. I thought like that was the place to make a difference. I work with civil society quite a bit today. I worked for the UN, or at least I was a UN appointee for many years. Each of those different places were different ways in which at least I tried to, not always successfully, make some little difference in the thing that I cared about. But the point is that it's not like just doing this one path is the only way to make a difference in the world. It's not like, I did think at a certain point that, well, going into government was the way to make a difference. But I think there's lots of room to make a difference in all sorts of areas of public life. And certainly for students who are thinking about like what your path might look like, there's so many opportunities, so many different ways to think about that. I also say value networking and community, right? There's as much as individuals matter, individuals who are making difference are often making a difference in community with others. So be a part of a community, that's very important. And then make your opportunities. The opportunities, like, so for me to pick up and go to Central Asia, like with not much money to do it, but to travel around and to find the people who were protesting, who were trying to seek democracy, to me that was super inspiring. And it's something that I wouldn't have found basically without going out and trying to find them. Okay, so I'm going to close because I think I'm at probably close to a half hour with just mentioning this one poem. And I'll just mention it because I want to urge people to go out and find it. So Czesław Miłosz was a great Nobel Prize winning Polish poet. actually lived in Berkeley for many years. So he had that. That was what made him cool in my eyes. But Czesław Miłosz was born in Polish-speaking Lithuania. He lived in Warsaw during the Second World War. And at that time, this is one of his early poems. He wrote this poem called Campo dei Fiori, where he writes about, I don't know if anybody's been to Rome, but Campo dei Fiori is a sort of central market square in Rome. And it's a place where if you go there early in the morning, it's kind of amazing. And he describes it, right? Baskets of olives and lemons, cobbles spattered with wine and the wreckage of flowers. It's kind of an amazing, beautiful, like alive place. But it was also the place that Giordano Bruno, who's a famous, seen by the Catholic Church as a heretic, where he was killed, where he was burned on a pyre, right? It says, henchmen kindled the pyre close pressed by the mob. And the thing that struck me about this poem is where he says, before the flames had died, that is the flames that consumed Giordano Bruno, the taverns were full again, baskets of olives and lemons again on the vendors' shoulders. And as the poem goes forward, Miłosz reflects on the fact that he's in Warsaw in 1943, and in Warsaw, in one part of the city, people were laughing and singing, drinking, more or less having a decent time. I mean, let's be honest, it was the Second World War. They probably weren't having the greatest time. But over the wall in the Warsaw Ghetto, where the Nazis had forced the Jewish community into increasingly small and really desolate space, people were dying. So on one side of the wall, people are happy doing their normal thing. On the other side of the wall, people are going through sort of unimaginable suffering. And he concludes, again, I'm not doing justice to this poem, but he concludes with this, what I think of as like a powerful statement about the word, right? It's, in a way, it's a statement about speech, but it's also about witnessing terrible crime. So he says, those dying here, the lonely, forgotten by the world, our tongue becomes for them the language of an ancient planet. And then you can read the rest. So I'm going to close here. I don't mean to be a downer. I mean to actually lift this up as saying, like, there are times, and there are going to be times certainly over the next few years when we as Americans need to speak up for the vulnerable in our own communities. And even as it becomes harder and harder to do that in this country, we need to remember there are also people outside of this country who also need our voice and our support and our witnessing of their traumas. So I'm going to close there. I'm really happy to take any questions and look forward to any questions that you have. Yeah. I think there might be a mic going around so that people on Zoom can hear you too.
Hello. Great presentation. My name is Michael Theodore. I'm a first-year PhD student in criminology, law, and society. And my question is this. When you look back at history, especially history related to jurisprudence, and with you being a law professor, can you think of any historical moments that's relevant to the conversation that we had today that can inform the way how we can protect people with free speech issues, freedom of expression issues?
Yeah, that's a really great question.
Thank you.
I don't even think we need to go very back far in time. We could look around the world at different places that have experienced something similar, maybe not as fast and not as sort of nuts as we're experiencing here, like just in the last 6 weeks. But, you could look at a place like Hungary, right? So Hungary under Viktor Orban over the last 15 years, basically. So looking at the situation there, Viktor Orban, was elected. He actually started his sort of public engagement as an Open Society fellow. He was a fellow. He had funding from George Soros, who he ultimately demonized later on. In any event, he very kind of quickly decimated the media by taking it over, more or less, decimating or putting the judiciary under his kind of authority. And by him, I mean him and his party. Taking action to protect Hungarian sovereignty. So basically forcing non-governmental organizations that had any support from the outside out of Hungary, more or less. And he cracked down on universities, basically forced the Central European University, which was an Open Society funded university, out of Budapest altogether, and now it's based in Vienna. Those are things that happened at the same time that civil society was really activated. So, for example, there's a Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, actually kind of like a sibling to our ACLU, who continue to use the courts in order to stop the worst of Orban's repressive activities. There are organizations like one called Kaye that focus on corruption, and they bring suits against the government for bad governance, basically. So they're using tools of law, they're using their speech, they're creating independent media that is often under pressure from Orban, but they do get access to those who are willing to find it. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, but it's sort of an ongoing thing that has been happening, for about 15 years. And we as Americans can, I think, get some, bit of hope, or at least some bit of kind of comparison for how we can still operate in an environment that looks like that. That's just a current one, but we could go sort of through history and look. I mentioned the Soviet Union before. Even in the context of the Soviet Union, which was not just authoritarian, but totalitarian in the sense of a state seeking to control, not just your public activities, but your very thoughts, right? Even in that context, there was something called samizdat, which was, it's a Russian word for essentially, hard to actually define it, but basically material that was censored that would circulate among the population. It's sort of an access to information issue as much as anything else. And people still learned about what was happening in the West. People still got, or at least in democratic parts of the world, they still listened to, classic rock, through Voice of America and things like that. So there's always this push and pull, and we, need to look to some of those who face situations worse than ours in many respects for some kind of inspiration, I think. Mm-hmm. You'll be next.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Jahan. I'm a senior in the School of Biological Sciences, and I had a bit of a question regarding your opinion or legal experience on the matter of whether educational institutions have the same right to freedom of speech as individuals do. I remember during COVID, it was a big question of do corporations, for example, or social media companies have the right to freedom of speech? Are they defined as a person? And specifically, my question would be with regards to educational institutions like UCI or Columbia University, things that have government funding invested into them. Do they have the same right to freedom of speech? And does the government have the right to manipulate what speech they output?
Yes, that's a great question and complex in a lot of ways. So I would slightly reframe it and say one of the core reasons why our universities work at all is because they have institutional autonomy. It's a core element of academic freedom, right? Is the ability of the university itself. So for academics, staff, students to decide what is their mission, right? That if you don't have that, if it's driven by the state, you basically end up with, I think, and you see this around the world, you end up with repression, you end up with poorer innovation, you end up with sort of threats and fears about what you can and cannot teach. And basically, you end up with people who are unwilling to speak, whether in the classroom or, in public protest or campus protest. So it's not just that the university has its own sort of freedom of expression. It's that the university has to have a kind of autonomy in order to determine its educational mission, its academic mission, and how that is articulated. And by university, I don't mean just the chancellor. I mean the chancellor, the faculty, staff, students, like everybody should be a part of it. It's a self-governance issue as much as anything else. I think that's a bit different. And the footnote there is I'm really quite concerned about the threats to universities right now. The funding cutoffs that we're seeing, from this administration are clearly directed towards viewpoint discrimination. And to me, this is probably the gravest threat to our universities, certainly in the last century. I mean, I think it's really grave. And if universities don't speak up about it, we're going to lose our universities. And probably some of you have studied abroad or want to study abroad, or you are here studying from abroad. A lot of that is going to be made impossible at the direction, sort of on the trajectory that we're going. So this is probably my biggest concern of the moment, to be honest. But it's really different than companies and their freedom of speech, because it's true, and the intro alluded to it. I wrote a book on kind of the competition between companies and states, I mean countries, and individuals over what should be the freedom of expression online. And companies do have a right to decide, what is their brand, right? Facebook or X, I guess, if you still want to use that, or Facebook. I mean, they have the right to say, these are our rules. And actually, that's enshrined in US law. I think that's a value. We should embrace that. The more those companies dominate public space, and the more they implicate public values like civic discourse or kind of the integrity of our information environment, the more responsibility they have. And that includes the responsibility to be transparent about the rules that they're making, but they still do have those kinds of rights. So that's how I would at least distinguish those two, like the university and companies. Similar, but a little bit different. There was a question way up here too. Okay, here.
They hand me the mic. I'll hand it over next. But my name is Ryan Fullen. I'm at the Entrepreneur Center. Thanks for the presentation. Love the photos, all that stuff. My question really parlays off of that, although it was a separate question, is whether it's myself or people I know or students, I feel like there is conversation around wanting to do something.
Yeah.
And my question to you is, what can people do? Because there is this real fear of anything that they do could feed into a retaliative type of, I don't know if that's a word, but there seems to be a fear, and how would you approach that from a possible lawyer perspective of how can we talk with students about ways to get involved, but still acknowledging their fear of the speech that they have the ability to do, yet what the result of that might be in question at this point?
Yeah, what you're describing is really an unfortunate moment, right? I mean, deeply unfortunate moment in that I think you're right. I hear the same thing from students. And I've seen students suffer from this retaliation for their involvement. Sometimes that retaliation, by the way, has nothing to do with what the person actually did. It's like misidentification, and then suddenly there's, a truck going around campus with their face on it. So the retaliation is real. So what I think is, two ways of thinking about it. I think faculty, staff, leadership on campus have a real responsibility to protect students and to ensure that this remains an environment where people can use campus as a form of public expression, whether that's protest or whatnot. obviously there's always rules around ensuring, non-disruption and stuff like that. But I would say those should be very light rules, and that the focus should be on creating an environment that is open to that. And to also saying to students, that's part of what your education is about. Your education isn't only in the classroom. Your education is also, engaging in community groups. It's engaging in campus protest if that's what you choose. It's, doing what Mario Savio did. I mean, the picture I showed there was him standing on a police car, right? I love that picture because he's standing on a police car so he's saying something about authority. At the same time, he's expressing himself to students, and students are also accessing his information. So I don't know if that's a really great answer, but but I do think that sort of for me as a member of the faculty and the administration have a real responsibility to protect students, and that means basically saying to anybody who might come on campus from outside that this is not your responsibility. This is ours. It goes back to the institutional autonomy point about the university. It's university rules. They should be freedom of expression rules. They should be open to civic discourse, and they should be protective of students. And the university should stand behind students, even if they disagree, even if individuals in the institution disagree with student viewpoint, that has to be a part of, student life and student ability. And I would say also, we've seen a couple of things. Like one, we're seeing right now, the Trump administration trying to deport somebody, I think, because I haven't seen allegations of incitement to violence or anything like that, but basically for the content of his protest and his organizing. Obviously, we could sort of drill down into that and learn more, but that as a kind of a demonstration effect, a kind of threat to students. If I were a student, I'd be concerned also about retaliation, and I think the university has to stand against that.
Hi, my name is Arisha. I'm a first-year criminology major, and I was just wondering, I think in your introduction, they talked about maybe your view on AI, and I was wondering, how would you characterize that in context of freedom of speech? Because on one end, obviously, AI does contort information quite a lot, especially maybe when it comes to like international issues, especially as in the United States, perhaps they would try to change information regarding political matters from other countries. But on the flip side, we have a lot of people who don't have access to information or can't as easily get information. And so things like, ChatGPT, or even if you look at, Instagram, I think has a new AI feature, Facebook does as well. That definitely, simplifies it. So a lot of people can actually see that information. And so I was wondering, like, what is your viewpoint on it, especially in terms of, international issues and relations?
Right. Right. Another small question about that. It's a great question. So I could give a whole spiel on AI, but I'll limit myself to a couple of points about AI. I mean, clearly AI has this potential to transform, if not like modern life, to transform the way we seek information, but it should also transform our critical faculties around information. Because the more information that is generated by AI, that information is only as good as the data set, the data that information is coming from. And if the data is like mostly from, let's say, English language sources, for example, well, what kind of truth, what kind of information are we actually able to get? And so, at least as we think about AI's development, as faculty, as students, I think we might actually use it as an opportunity to sort of double down on the importance of critical thinking, right? And not, we should always, whatever we're reading, we should always read it with a critical eye. Like, is the assertion, is the premise correct? With AI, I think that's even more important to do, because so much. Like if you've ever done a chat GPT search and you knew something about the topic and you're like, this isn't exactly right, you know that you need to do that critical thinking, and you would want others who are new to that topic to do that critical thinking too. So I think maybe, I'm not generally a silver lining person, but maybe a silver lining of AI's sort of threat to information is that we can actually use it as an opportunity to reinforce, sort of the fundamentals of critical thinking. The other thing I would say about AI is it's not just the data, right? But it's also the people who are making these new models, right? And it's easy to assume that technology is neutral. It's not, right? Technology is also about who's made the technology, who's in the room to make the technology. This is where all this attack on diversity and equity, for example, to me seems just counterproductive. Like put aside the discriminatory parts of it, it seems counterproductive because our information environment is so much richer when we have diverse sources of information and diverse inputs and individuals who are part of making that information environment. So I think that when we think about AI, we should be thinking about it. I mean, those are two of, infinite ways of thinking about it.
I'm happy to read this question
Okay.
online to you.
Yeah.
And this will be the last one we'll take. In light of what you shared about the freedom of opinion and expression outlined in Article 19, what might concern or excite you about court decisions and political activities locally and nationally around book bans and the potential criminalization of library workers?
That's an awesome question. Right, so the background is, for those who don't know, I mean, there's been a steep rise in school boards and public libraries around the country essentially banning particular books. Oftentimes, now this is like a big deal in Florida, where it's now possible, right, for parents to put a book on a list in order for that book to be banned from the library, right? And so that's a huge problem. I do think that, and we're seeing this even in the context of a lot of the court decisions around the Trump administration over the last couple of months, that our courts are still independent, they're still functioning, there are still lawyers out there willing to take these cases, there are students, and sometimes young students, I mean like younger than university students, who are willing to be named plaintiffs in these kinds of cases. And to me, that's heartening, right? That's a positive element. The fact that we're actually talking about book banning in 2025 is depressing at a certain level. The one thing I want to just mention about that as a human rights law issue is, freedom of expression, the freedom of expression that I mentioned here it's a fundamental right. It's not just a right that, adults have, right? So there's something called the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which every country in the world is a party to, except for one. You can guess which one is not a party to it. Well, it's us. I won't hide the ball. Right, so the United States is not a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But the Convention on the Rights of the Child says that children also have rights to freedom of expression. And so as we think, and that means the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds. So in these book bans, it would be nice if Americans spoke human rights law. I mean, we basically don't. Human rights law is not a basis for causes of action in the United States, for example. But to the extent that we can inject into the debate, not just the idea that parents have rights to shape their children's education, which of course is true, but children also have rights to access information, right? Whatever that information might be. Now, it might not be appropriate. Some information, some books might not be appropriate for a 7-year-old, even when they're appropriate for a 14-year-old. And that goes back to institutional autonomy, the same for elementary schools and public libraries. They can make those kinds of choices. But we need to be thinking about freedom of expression, not just for, adults and parents as a kind of authority matter, but also as a matter of how we want our children to be educated. I'll stop there.
Let's
Thank
thank Professor Kaye one more time.